On the morning of January 26, 1972, a 22-year-old flight attendant boarded a routine commercial flight from Copenhagen to Belgrade, expecting nothing more than an ordinary workday in the sky. She had no idea that within a few hours, she would fall from a height of over 33,000 feet, roughly 6 miles, without a parachute, and survive. Not just survive the fall itself, but go on to live for decades afterward. To understand how something like this is even possible, you have to understand that the human body, under an extraordinarily specific and rare set of circumstances, can survive things that seem to violate everything we assume about physics and biology. Let's start with the basic numbers, because they matter enormously here. 33,000 feet is roughly the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner. At that height, the air is thin enough that passengers need pressurized cabins just to breathe comfortably, and temperatures regularly drop to negative 50 degrees Celsius. A human body falling from that height, in open air, with nothing to slow it down, would reach a terminal velocity somewhere around 120 miles per hour within less than a minute, and the impact with solid ground at that speed is, under almost all circumstances, immediately and completely fatal. The math here isn't ambiguous. This is not a survivable fall by any conventional measure, which is exactly what makes what happened next so extraordinary. The aircraft she was on broke apart mid-flight after an explosion in the cargo hold, and the wreckage, along with everyone and everything on board, was sent tumbling toward the ground from cruising altitude. What investigators eventually pieced together is that she remained attached to a section of the fuselage, specifically a portion of the tail section containing several rows of seats, as it separated from the rest of the aircraft and began its own descent, essentially becoming a separate, smaller falling object rather than a lone human body in freefall. This detail turns out to be critically important, and here's why. A human body falling alone accelerates quickly toward a high terminal velocity with very little air resistance working in its favor because a body is relatively dense and aerodynamically efficient at cutting through air. A larger piece of wreckage, especially one that's irregularly shaped, tumbling and rotating rather than falling in a straight line, behaves completely differently. It catches more air, generates more drag, and depending on its shape and rotation, can significantly reduce the effective speed of anything attached to or inside it by the time it reaches the ground. She wasn't simply falling. She was, in effect, inside an extremely crude, entirely accidental parachute made of aircraft debris, one that nobody designed and nobody could have planned for, but one that mattered enormously for what came next. Then there's the matter of where the wreckage actually landed, and this is where luck starts compounding in ways that feel almost impossible to coincide. The debris came down on a heavily forested, snow-covered mountainside. Both of those details independently reduce impact force in measurable ways. Trees, particularly dense forest canopy, absorb and dissipate kinetic energy as branches break and bend on the way down, essentially acting as a series of natural shock absorbers rather than a single hard stop. Snow adds another layer of cushioning on top of that, compacting and absorbing force rather than transmitting it directly and instantly into the human body making contact with it. Land on bare rock or pavement at a similar effective speed, and the outcome is almost certainly different. Land in trees and snow, and you've been handed, entirely by chance, two of the best possible surfaces for surviving significant impact. There's also a detail about her physical state that researchers who later studied the case pointed to as potentially significant. She was reportedly unconscious for most or all of the fall itself. This sounds counterintuitive, the idea that being unconscious could actually improve your odds of survival, but there's a real physiological basis for it. A conscious body under extreme stress tends to tense up, and tensed muscles and rigid posture transmit impact force through the skeleton in ways that are far more likely to cause catastrophic, unabsorbed trauma. An unconscious body is comparatively loose and limp. It doesn't brace, doesn't fight the fall, doesn't rigidify in anticipation of impact. Paradoxically, that limpness may have allowed her body to absorb and distribute the force of landing in a way that a tensed, conscious body attempting to protect itself would not have been able to replicate. When rescuers eventually located her, she had suffered severe injuries, a fractured skull, several broken vertebrae, a broken pelvis, and multiple broken limbs. This wasn't some kind of miraculous, unscathed landing. Her body absorbed genuine, serious trauma consistent with an extraordinary impact. She spent weeks in a coma and months in recovery, and her injuries were severe enough that doctors initially weren't confident she would regain full mobility. But she did recover, eventually walking again, eventually returning to something resembling a normal life, and living for decades afterward. The Guinness World Records organization recognizes her fall as the highest survived without a parachute, a record that has stood for over 5 decades. What makes this case scientifically fascinating rather than simply a story of extraordinary luck is how many independent factors had to align simultaneously for survival to even be theoretically possible. Remove any single one of these variables: the fuselage section reducing fall speed through drag and rotation, the forested mountainside absorbing impact energy in stages, the snow cushioning the final contact, the unconscious state preventing catastrophic muscular rigidity, and the outcome almost certainly changes from a survival story into a fatality statistic like every other passenger on that flight. This wasn't one lucky break. It was an entire chain of independent, compounding pieces of luck, each one individually improbable, all occurring together in the same few minutes. Researchers who study extreme trauma survival cases use situations like this one to better understand the actual physical limits of human survivability, because these edge cases reveal something genuinely useful. The human body is far more resilient under specific, favorable conditions than most people assume. But that resilience depends enormously on external factors largely outside the individual's control. It's not that the human body is simply tougher than we give it credit for in some abstract, general sense. It's that under a very narrow, very specific combination of circumstances, the body's actual physical limits turn out to be dramatically higher than the numbers alone would suggest. So the next time you hear about a survival story that sounds almost too extreme to be real, it's worth remembering that these cases aren't evidence that humans can casually withstand the impossible. They're evidence of just how many separate variables have to align: terminal velocity, drag, surface composition, physical state at impact, before an event that should be uniformly fatal becomes, against nearly every reasonable expectation, something a human body can walk away from.